The feeling that something was wrong arrived the way most bad things do, quietly, without announcement, buried beneath the ordinary noise of a Tuesday morning. I had been standing at my kitchen sink, watching the sparrows fight over the feeder I'd hung in the yard the summer after I retired from teaching, when I realized I hadn't spoken to my daughter in 10 days. Not a text, not a voice memo, not one of those silly photographs she used to send me of her cat sitting in increasingly inconvenient places. 10 days was not like her. 10 days was the kind of silence that sits differently in a mother's chest than any other kind. I called twice that morning and got her voicemail both times. I called my son-in-law in the afternoon, and he answered on the third ring with a voice that was just a little too level. "Everything's fine," he said. "She's been busy with a project at work. You know how she gets." He laughed once, short and practiced, and I said, "Of course," and hung up the phone. But I stood in my kitchen for a long time after that, turning my phone over in my hands. My daughter had given me a small ceramic dish on my last birthday, painted with yellow flowers, and I kept it on the windowsill above the sink. She had driven 4 hours from Portland to Savannah to give it to me in person, sitting at this very table, drinking my coffee and laughing too loud at her own jokes the way she always had since she was a girl. That was the daughter I knew. The daughter who did not go 10 days without calling her mother. I booked a flight that evening. I told myself it was probably nothing. I packed a small bag and set my neighbor's number on the counter in case she needed to water the plants. And I told myself the whole drive to the airport that I was being dramatic, that my son-in-law had said everything was fine, that I was a 63-year-old woman who had raised one child alone after her father left and learned to manage her anxiety with chamomile tea and long walks. And this was exactly the kind of situation where I needed to apply both. I landed in Portland at 7:30 in the morning. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the air carried that particular Pacific Northwest damp that never quite dries off your skin. I took a rideshare to my daughter's neighborhood, watching the familiar streets pass outside the window, the coffee shop she'd taken me to on my last visit, in the park where her cat had once escaped, and she'd spent an entire afternoon in tears before he turned up behind a trash can 2 blocks away. The house looked ordinary from the outside. Porch light still on in the morning. One of the front planters had tipped over and no one had righted it. The recycling bin sat at the curb 3 days past collection day. I rang the bell. No answer. I knocked. Nothing. The woman next door was leaving for work, keys in hand, and she slowed when she saw me. She asked if I was Claire's mother, and something in the way she asked it carefully, like a person choosing each word before she set it down, told me everything before she said another word. She told me my daughter had been in an accident 9 days ago. A wet road, an intersection, a truck that came through a red light. She had been at OHSU ever since. She told me my son-in-law had come by the house a few times but hadn't stayed. She had seen him once with another woman, a week ago, carrying boxes out through the side door. I don't remember what I said to her. I remember my hand finding the strap of my bag, gripping it, and I remember the sound of her voice still going while I walked back toward the street. The hospital was 20 minutes away. It felt like nothing and forever at the same time. The elevator to the ICU was slow. I pressed the button for the 6th floor and stood watching the numbers change, my reflection pale in the steel door, and I thought about my daughter at age 7, running across our backyard in a bathing suit in October because she insisted summer wasn't over yet. I thought about the phone calls we'd had over the years, the arguments about her choices and mine, the long stretches of distance that always eventually folded back into closeness. I thought about the ceramic dish with the yellow flowers and the 4-hour drive to give it to me in person. The doors opened, and I walked to the nurse's station. They brought me to her room, and I stood in the doorway for a moment before I could make myself go in. She looked small in a way I was not prepared for. My daughter is not a small woman. She fills a room the way I always wished I had: loud laugh, big gestures, the kind of presence that rearranges the air when she walks in. But she lay very still beneath the hospital blankets, a breathing tube removed now, oxygen by cannula, a bruise along her left jaw faded to yellow-green. The monitor beside her beeped with steady patience. Her hair had been pushed back from her face by someone's careful hand, and on her left wrist, barely visible under the edge of the blanket, was the silver bracelet I had given her on her wedding day. A thin chain with a single pressed flower charm, delicate and slightly tarnished now. She had never taken it off. I pulled the chair close and sat beside her and took her hand. And I did not let myself fall apart, because I have spent my life believing that falling apart is something you do later, in private, after the work is done. A doctor came in within the hour. She was young, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she spoke to me with the particular combination of clinical precision and human decency that I have always respected in people who do hard things for a living. She told me my daughter had been in a medically induced coma for 6 days, brought out of it 2 days ago, still heavily sedated. There had been a bleed in her brain, addressed surgically. The prognosis was cautiously hopeful. She was expected to regain full consciousness, though recovery would take time. I asked about visitors. The doctor looked at her tablet briefly. Her husband had come twice in the first 3 days, she said. Once more 4 days ago. No one since. I sat with that information for a moment. Then I asked the doctor to walk me through everything she knew, and I listened to every word, and I asked every question I had. And when she left, I sat back down beside my daughter and held her hand and told her quietly that I was here now and that she did not have to do anything except rest, and that I was going to take care of everything else. I meant it the way I have always meant that particular promise. Absolutely. I stayed through the afternoon and into the evening, and when my daughter stirred and opened her eyes for the first time, unfocused and glassy but present, I leaned close and said her name and watched her face slowly arrange itself around recognition. She couldn't speak easily yet, but her fingers tightened around mine. That was enough. I drove to her house that night with the spare key I had always kept on my own keyring, the one she'd given me years ago, saying, "You never know, Mom," and she'd been right. She'd always been right about the practical things. The house was not quite right in the way that houses get, when no one is maintaining the ordinary rhythms of a life lived in them. Mail piled inside the door. A coffee mug left on the counter, contents long dried to a dark ring, the plants on the windowsill beginning to droop. Her cat came to meet me at the door and cried with an urgency that told me his food bowl had been empty longer than it should have been. I fed him first. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and began to go through the mail. The first thing I found was a bank statement, the kind generated when an account balance falls below a threshold. The joint checking account my daughter and her husband shared had dropped from just over 4 regular transfers, each just under 10,000, moved to an account I didn't recognize. I set that paper aside and kept going. There was a letter from a real estate attorney's office, addressed to my son-in-law, confirming the preparation of documents to transfer the deed of the house into the name of an LLC. The date on the letter was 6 days ago. I sat very still at that kitchen table for a while. My daughter had given me her financial power of attorney 3 years ago, during a health scare that had turned out to be nothing, but had frightened us both enough that she had called her attorney the following week and put everything in order. She had also named me her healthcare proxy. I had the documents in a folder at home in Savannah, in the second drawer of the filing cabinet, where I kept everything important. I had hoped I would never need them. I had kept them anyway. I found the household tablet charging on the counter. It was still logged into the shared account they used for grocery lists and home maintenance reminders, and because my daughter trusted her life with a simplicity I had sometimes envied, her messages were synced there too. I opened them, not knowing what I was looking for. I found it within 2 minutes. The thread with a contact saved as V was recent, the most recent messages from 8 days ago. The conversation covered several weeks. It began warmly and moved quickly to logistics. "The house," he wrote at one point, "is going to be easier to transfer before there's any probate question. She never updated the beneficiaries after we married. Her mother has some kind of paperwork, but I don't think it amounts to anything. Let's move before she wakes up or before she doesn't. Before she wakes up or before she doesn't." I read that line several times. Then I set the tablet down on the table and pressed both hands flat against the surface and breathed slowly, the way I had taught myself to do in 30 years, of managing other people's crises in school hallways and parent conferences and moments that required someone to remain upright when everything was tilting. I called my son-in-law. He answered after 4 rings, his voice carrying the ambient sound of a restaurant or bar, conversation and music blurred together behind him. He said my name with a surprise he didn't quite sell. I told him I was in Portland, that I was at the house, that I had been to the hospital and sat with my daughter. He said that was great, that he'd been meaning to get back up there, that it had been a hard week. I asked him to tell me about the LLC. The pause that followed was a very particular kind of pause, the kind that comes from a person recalibrating. He said it was just asset protection, something his financial advisor had suggested, completely routine. He said it in the smooth way of someone who has rehearsed a thing enough times that the words have lost their shape. I told him I had the power of attorney my daughter had signed. I told him I had spoken with her attorney that afternoon, which was not yet true but would be true by morning. I told him that I intended to use every document and every legal means available to me to make sure that not one thing that belonged to my daughter moved anywhere until she was awake and sitting upright and able to tell me herself what she wanted done with it. There was another pause, longer this time. Then he said, "You need to be careful, Margaret. She's my wife. You don't have authority over my marriage." I said quietly, "Get a good lawyer," and I ended the call. I was on the phone with my daughter's attorney by 7 the next morning. She was sharp and quick, and she had the power of attorney documents I'd photographed and emailed her before 8. By 10, she had filed the paperwork to have the POA recognized and had contacted the bank. By noon, the joint accounts were frozen pending legal review, and the real estate transfer had been flagged and halted. My son-in-law left 8 voicemails between 10 and 2. They followed a predictable arc. The first 3 were controlled anger dressed up as reason. The middle 2 were louder, edged with something that wanted to be menace but couldn't quite get there. The last 3 were a different register, entirely quieter, almost plaintive, talking about how hard things had been, about how I didn't understand the pressure he'd been under, about how we could work this out, if I would just be reasonable. He did not say my daughter's name in any of them. I listened to all 8 in the hospital parking lot before I went up to see her. She was more alert that afternoon. She couldn't manage full sentences yet, and speaking tired her quickly, but she tracked my movements around the room with clear eyes, and when I showed her a photograph of her cat, sprawled on the kitchen floor in a patch of sun she'd taken the previous spring, the left side of her mouth curved upward in the beginning of a smile. I held her hand and told her that I was handling some things. I told her not to worry. She looked at me for a long moment, with an expression I recognized because it was the one she'd worn her whole life when she was trying to decide how much to ask and how much to trust. Then she closed her fingers around mine again, and she closed her eyes. That was enough. The weeks that followed were the kind that collapse in memory, each day dense with logistics and motion, looking back feeling shorter than they were. My daughter moved from ICU to a step-down unit. She moved from the step-down unit to a rehabilitation floor. She began speaking in full sentences, then paragraphs, then one afternoon called me from her room to complain about the hospital's idea of coffee, and I stood in the hallway outside and laughed until my eyes watered. The legal process moved alongside her recovery. My son-in-law had retained an attorney of his own, a man with a very expensive suit and a way of talking that suggested he could, and he considered other people's inconvenience to be a kind of texture in his professional landscape. He argued spousal rights. He argued that the POA had been granted under different circumstances and did not apply here. He argued a great many things with great confidence. My daughter's attorney argued back. She had the documents. She had the timeline of withdrawals, each one dated and timed, the pattern clear. She had the text messages, retrieved properly with the assistance of counsel, including the one that said before she wakes up, or before she doesn't. She had financial records, showing the LLC had been established 11 days before the accident, and assets had begun moving into it the day after my daughter was admitted to the hospital. The hearing was held on a Thursday morning, in a courtroom that smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee. My son-in-law arrived with his attorney, and sat across the aisle in a jacket I didn't recognize, which meant it was new, which meant he'd spent money on it recently, which told me something about his state of mind. He glanced at me once when he sat down, and then looked steadily forward. My daughter's attorney laid out the case methodically, the way good teachers lay out a lesson not for drama but for clarity, so that every person in the room ended up in the same place at the end. The judge was a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses she wore on the tip of her nose and a way of reviewing documents that suggested she had seen every version of this particular story, and was not surprised by any of them. When my son-in-law's attorney stood to speak, he led with sympathy. "A man under terrible stress," he said. "A wife gravely injured. The uncertainty of the outcome. Decisions made imperfectly in the fog of grief. Surely the court could understand." The judge looked at him over her glasses. She asked him to direct her to the page in the financial records that showed the LLC formation predating the accident by 11 days. He found the page. He tried to reframe it. She thanked him and asked him to sit. She reviewed the documents for a long moment. Then she lifted her eyes to the room. The motion to freeze the transferred assets was granted. Control of the joint accounts was placed in my hands pending my daughter's recovery and her own legal action to follow. The real estate transfer was reversed. My son-in-law was ordered to provide a full accounting of all funds moved from joint accounts in the 6 weeks prior to and following the accident. My son-in-law stood up when the gavel came down, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something. His attorney put a hand on his arm and he sat back down slowly, and whatever he had been about to say, he swallowed. I gathered my things and walked out of the courtroom into the hallway and called my daughter. She answered on the second ring, which meant she had been watching the phone. I told her it was done. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mom," in the voice she'd used when she was 12 and something had hurt her, and she didn't have bigger words for it yet. I told her she could let it out later. Right now she needed to rest. I told her I would be there in an hour. My daughter came home 3 weeks after the hearing. Not to the house she'd shared with her husband. Her attorney had filed for separation, and the house was in legal stasis while matters were sorted. But home to me, 4 hours south in Savannah, into the room she had grown up in, which I had slowly turned into a guest room over the years, and now very quickly turned back. I carried her bag in from the car and she stood in the doorway of her old room looking at the quilt on the bed, the same quilt that had been there since she was 14, and she was quiet for so long that I came to stand beside her. She said, "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't come." I said, "I know, but I did." She looked at me then, and she looked like every age she'd ever been, all at once. And she said, "How did you know?" I thought about the ceramic dish on the windowsill, the sparrows at the feeder on a Tuesday morning, 30 years of knowing one person's rhythms well enough to feel the silence before you can name it. I said, "I just did, that's all." Recovery was not a straight line. It rarely is. There were days she was bright and energetic and wanted to cook complicated meals and talk about everything, and there were days she sat very still in the armchair in the living room and looked out at the yard and didn't say much, and I learned quickly which days needed which kind of presence. Sometimes she needed me in the room. Sometimes she needed me in the next room. Sometimes she needed me to pretend I wasn't paying attention while I paid very close attention, which is a skill I had refined over 30 years of teaching 12-year-olds and had apparently been saving for exactly this. Her cat had made the drive down in a carrier wedged between our luggage, and he installed himself immediately on the armchair beside her with the proprietary confidence of an animal who considers a human's lap his primary residence. He was, in the end, a significant part of the recovery process, not something I would have predicted, but then I had learned to stop predicting. One afternoon in the second month, she was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a mug of tea gone cold beside her, and she called me over to show me something she'd been reading. It was a study about financial abuse during medical incapacitation, how often it happened, how rarely it was recognized in time, how many families never recovered what was lost because no one had the right documents in place. She had printed a number of pages. She had taken notes in the margins. She said, "I want to do something." I sat down across from her and said, "Tell me." She had been thinking, she said, about the women who didn't have a mother with a spare key and a filing cabinet with the right paperwork in it. The ones who woke up from something terrible and found themselves already emptied out before they'd had a chance to understand what had been done to them. She had been thinking about what a small thing it was, really, to have the documents in order, and how few people knew to do it, and how much it mattered when the difference was the difference. We talked for 3 hours that afternoon. Her tea went cold and mine went cold too, and I made a second pot and we kept talking. We called it the Silver Bracelet Fund, her idea. She looked at her wrist when she set it at the thin chain with the pressed flower charm, still there, still slightly tarnished, and she said that was what she wanted to name it. Something small that holds. The organization we built over the following year provided 2 things: legal document preparation assistance for women who couldn't afford attorneys, and emergency financial advocacy for women in medical crises who had no one positioned to act on their behalf. We partnered with 3 hospitals in the Southeast in the first year. We trained volunteers. We wrote guides in plain language because my daughter said, rightly, that most legal documents read as if they were designed to make ordinary people feel that the law did not belong to them, and we were going to fix that. I went back to Portland once for a meeting with a potential partner organization. I drove past the neighborhood where my daughter had lived, without planning to, just because the route took me that way. The house looked the same from the outside. Someone had righted the planter on the front porch. I didn't stop. I kept driving. On an evening the following spring, my daughter and I drove out to the coast, a 3-hour drive from Savannah to a stretch of Georgia shoreline she had loved since she was a girl. We spread a blanket on the sand and ate sandwiches and watched the light change over the water, and the cat had stayed home, but she had brought a photograph, an old one, from years ago, the 2 of us in this same spot, younger, squinting into the sun, laughing at something that had been lost to time, but that had clearly been very funny. She put it in the sand, leaning it against a piece of driftwood, and we sat with it for a while. She said she had something to tell me. She said she had been talking to the rehabilitation counselor about what came next, and that she was thinking about going back to Portland eventually, when she was ready, but that she wanted to build something first that was entirely her own and couldn't be taken away by anyone. I told her that sounded exactly right. She said, "I'm not angry anymore. Not like I was." I said, "You were allowed to be." She said, "I know, but I don't want to carry it. I've been carrying it and I've been thinking all that energy. I want to put it somewhere it does something." She looked at her wrist, at the bracelet, and then she looked at me. I think sometimes that being a mother is mostly learning to let someone become fully themselves while staying close enough that they know where home is. I had not always done this gracefully. There had been years when I held on too tightly, and years when I thought keeping distance was the same thing as giving space, and I had been wrong in both directions, more times than I like to count, but I had kept the spare key. I had kept the documents in the second drawer, and I had paid attention to the silence. The sun went down over the water in long stripes of gold and pink, the kind of sunset that looks almost too deliberate, as if someone arranged it, and my daughter leaned her head against my shoulder, the way she hadn't done since she was maybe 9 years old. And I did not move, and I did not say anything, because some moments ask only to be held. The bracelet caught the last of the light, small and simple, and still there. After a while she lifted her head and looked at the horizon and she said, "What do you think we should tackle first? The Georgia hospitals or the Florida ones?" I thought about 30 years of school hallways, tired plants on windowsills, sparrows fighting at the feeder on an ordinary morning that turned out to be anything but. I said, "Let's start where we are." She nodded. And we started.